Thank you very much for coming to this session all about AI and editors. If you're hoping that AI is going to get you a job, you need to go next door with Abigail. But assuming you're happy where you are, you're in the right place. We're going to be talking about the role of artificial intelligence in editorial decision-making, but also copy editing and editing in its broadest sense. I'm hopefully joined. Have we got Jessamy coming by Zoom? Oh, you're there, but I can see you. There you are, brilliant. So we've got three panelists. We're going to be talking over the next 40 minutes on a topic that I think hasn't been addressed enough. We talk a lot about how AI is affecting authors, but of course AI is affecting the way that editors are thinking and are behaving too, and has profound implications for the future. So my name's James Butcher. I'm going to let the three panelists introduce themselves, and I'd like to, if I could, invite Jessamy to kick us off. So if you could introduce yourself, and if you could also explain, how are you using AI at the moment in your work?
My name is Jessamy Bagenal. I'm a senior executive editor at The Lancet. I trained as a physician, and I've been at The Lancet since 2018. Before I was doing clinical practice, and alongside that worked with the BMJ in various different roles. Yes, we use generative AI. Elsevier has created its own in-house Elsevier AI Pro, which is currently in its pilot stage, and which various different editors are using across the organization.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Emily, same for you. How are you using AI at all at PLOS?
Yes, so it's not, I would say, part of our routine business as usual workflow, but we are certainly at the stage now that we're investigating where AI might support us in our role as editors and publishers. So we take the view that AI has enormous potential, but we are very much focused on ensuring that any AI outputs are checked very carefully by humans, as I think Jake said in his keynote, with that cognition part that's really important to ensure that it's right.
Perfect. And Ian, as someone who actually knows about AI, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Ian Mulvaney. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the British Medical Journal. I'm also the Treasurer for Dryad. I'm a technologist that's worked in the industry for about 20 years, building different systems with technology. I use AI in my own work day to day, almost every day, just to help me with small tasks. We're a much smaller organization than Elsevier at BMJ, so we haven't had the capacity to build our own custom tools, but we have found using off-the-shelf tools to be very helpful. We've built a group who check for use cases. We're concerned about protecting the integrity of our brand. And so we've had about 16 use cases that have come through review in that group over the last year. And those range from helping us to increase the density of our knowledge bank in some of our question and answer products, looking to explore summarization, looking to help do automated tagging with some of our structured data. And we're using it a lot on the software engineering side as well. But that's just with really almost off-the-shelf tooling. So even without a large engineering effort behind you, I think you can get started in very interesting ways in your organization.
So do you think, from where we are now, have we given our authors enough guidance on how to use AI in terms of the way that they are putting together their paper? Let's start with you, Emily, first of all.
Sure. Well, I think that's an interesting question, because I think the issue here may not be the guidance that we're offering authors, but whether or not authors are reading the guidance. And also,
that's always been a problem.
Exactly, right? But also as an industry, I don't think we've actually settled on a single sort of standard that we want authors to follow. And so I really don't envy them if they're trying to comply with different journals' disclosures and different journals' way of approaching AI. So I think, we have a responsibility to understand what we actually are asking of authors and to make it simple for them to comply.
You could also argue, I guess, that we don't make it easy for authors in terms of things like reference lists, or there's lots of or style guides. I mean, every journal has their own style guide. So how, Ian, are we being realistic about having a common set of instructions for authors that we expect to follow? I mean, they must be confused, right? I mean, how can we help them?
Well, I've seen different journals come out with radically different approaches to Gen AI. I think transparency is really key, so we have to ask authors to be transparent about how they're using it. But as a community, I don't think we still have a collective view on what we think about it, because it's beginning to touch on the very idea of what authorship is. So yeah, for sure we're not giving clear guidance. For sure authors are leaning into it much faster than we're comfortable as organizations. That's where we are, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, that question that Jake touched on in his plenary of what is scholarship. I mean, Jessamy, I don't know whether the Lancet has been, thinking about how AI may change the very concept of authorship when authors are potentially using it to enhance their work, come up with ideas. I mean, is that something you've been discussing as a group?
Yes, we're discussing it all the time. And we were in a meeting recently and a colleague of mine said that whenever we talk about generative AI as an agenda item, we have to leave at least 45 minutes because we know that it's going to take a lot longer than we think it's going to take. So yeah, this is a big topic of discussion within the Lancet group, and I know across Elsevier. It's a rapidly moving field, and we're all trying to gauge what these tools really mean. My own personal thinking has developed also, and I see them more and more now as efficiency tools. I don't see them as tools at this stage that are able to take over anything like human thought in the way that I use it, and in the way I see authors using it. In the submissions that we get, we have a checkbox for all of our submissions where we ask if authors have used generative AI, and then for our editors, a red A will come up with those submissions. And when I look across at those submissions, the quality of them, if they have been used for structure or for anything more than English language, is not to the same level as human insight and thought on health topics across the board.
And do you get a sense, are the authors being honest? In other words, are you able to do any kind of quality control that the people who tick the box and say, we've used AI, are there others who should have ticked that box but haven't?
Well, exactly. It's an incredibly difficult thing to police. And again, this is a work in progress for us. At the moment, we are considering how we try and monitor that. And I think we're probably moving to a place where we do ask for the prompts that have been used and for the exact models and versions that's been used in, as some way of trying to understand whether what authors are telling us is reflected in the work that they're submitting.
Okay, I mean, I guess one way you could detect it is through hallucinations. And I've got a question for Ian from a technology perspective. I mean, are we going to solve that problem? Is that, so hallucinations, the idea that, references are made up, other things are patched together. That to me seems to be, for scholarship, one of the biggest problems at the moment with AI, but presumably that will be overcome at some point or not?
Yeah, so the core tool, the language model itself, is a statistical tool. And so it'll just come out with words that seem likely to answer the kind of question that's being asked when you put in the prompts. And so if you just use the raw tool itself, that will always have some drift compared to maybe what you wanted or compared to what you think reality is. That will never go away. And a great challenge that we have in product development is thinking about how to create tools that have a random component to them when people have been used to tools that work in a really fixed way. But that said, I keep up to date with the literature as much as I can, and there's an enormous amount of work on trying to think about how to create cohorts of AIs that work together to review each other's work. Think of ways to create cohorts of AI that connect to a bank of the literature that it draws on to create the text. There's innovations around trying to think about how when a sentence has been created, you can see where it's being drawn from or where its references come from. And on things like generating and hallucinating references, some of the tools that I've seen that have come out in the last couple of months just default to using things like the Semantic Scholar API to embed references in the works, which takes away the problem entirely. So yeah, we're at a point where the tools can't compete with human thought by any means, and maybe they never will, they probably never will, but that we're even having this discussion around a technology that can create language and that can edit language, which didn't exist a year and a half ago, is astonishing. And we're still only 2 to 3 generations in from what these models have been trained on so far. So that's a bit of a broad digression, But I think the way we are worried about hallucination will broadly be solved by approaches. However, and this is really critical, that does not to take away our responsibility for standing behind what we publish by any means. And that is always going to be the first line of defense. So whatever they are doing today, these tools will become more capable for sure within the next 12 months. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doubling down hard on putting in place the right types of editorial processes to ensure the veracity and quality of the work that we're standing behind. It will, however, and should, however, help accelerate many of the processes that are involved in the creation of that value.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question?
Yeah.
So when I hear you say that we may be fixing these problems around hallucination, I'm sure that it's not any surprise to know that some of the detection tools are currently based on how poor some of the Gen AI tools are in references, for example, in tortured phrases. So if we're going to fix that problem, how are we going to stay a step ahead of paper mills and other, services that aim to churn out research that's based on nothing?
So if the paper has been generated by a computer and yet creates a new and accurate claim about the state of affairs of the world that is accurate, does that matter?
Who's the author?
If we're in the business of trying to understand the state of the world, then that should be one of the things that leads us in our thinking here. And so authorship then becomes a question of what was the funding that went in to create the environment for framing that question, putting the data together, and creating the process that led to that insight. And so the defense against this, anyone who's coming to the table with tooling which tells you this tool will identify LLMs, can always be superseded by training a small model which you tell it, don't write in this way.
Yeah.
So those tools will be a patchwork, but will always never do the job. The job that you have to ask yourself is, how do I tell whether the claims are valid? How do I tell whether the person is valid? And how do I tell whether this is worth the attention of my audience? Now, as far as I am aware, those have been the questions which should always have been our concern.
Yeah.
So I guess, one of the, there's lots of different types of editing. But one of the core bits of editing is after acceptance, editors will go through and copy edit and check. Jessamy, at The Lancet, there's a big team of assistant editors that do this. Are they, how are they thinking about how Gen AI can help in the future? There's some people in the audience here and perhaps online as well who run editing services. How do you think that might affect what they're doing in the future? Is that something you guys are talking about?
Yeah, we're talking about it a lot. I think it's a fine line, isn't it? And we have to take this within the context of the broader sort of research integrity questions which we all face. And actually having human oversight, people going through line by line a particular manuscript, is a huge deterrent and a huge preventative measure for paper mills or for fabrication. It's by no means foolproof, but it is one way that we're able to make sure that everything that we're publishing has been read by a human. So I think, there's that part. And on the other side, we are an expanding industry. We publish more and more each year. It's actually almost impossible for any journal or publication system to really keep up with that level of research and to keep the quality up as necessary. And so we need these tools to be able to combat the research integrity side, but also to help on the efficiency side. So I think it's hard to say where it will go. There's an ideal scenario where humans continue to have that oversight, humans continue to be editors and to have responsibility for content, and generative AI is supportive in making everything more efficient and everything much smoother. Whether that's what will actually happen will probably depend on the commercial determinants of our industry, I suppose.
Yeah, Ian, you've, I think on your blog recently, you said that at the BMJ you had a really good look at the content that was coming in, and the proportion that was, what you might consider to be bad actors, and it was relatively low. Is that right?
Well, I talked to him after you mentioned that in your blog that you were surprised.
It's a bit.
By the way, we both have blogs, and
if anyone wants to sign up to the blog,
I talked to our research integrity editor, Helen, and she said we haven't seen evidence of it. And we think it's probably because we have fairly high touchpoint editorial processes, but we couldn't say with complete certainty what those numbers are. And so it's more an absence of evidence than an evidence of absence at this point in time. But I want to come back to the question you asked about editorial workflows and what's happening where we touched those articles. And just to touch on something we were discussing over lunch, I think there is some really interesting opportunities here. And we saw a little bit of it with Sam in the previous session. So today when we think about looking at an article, by and large, we're still looking at that article as an individual entity, and we have someone going through and doing the editing at the individual article level. And with these tools, an analogy I heard came from Bloomberg was when we think of any technology, we can ask, does that technology act like a calculator which helps us do what we're doing today, but faster? Or is it more like a weaving loom where it takes work and displaces people who work on it? Or is the technology more like a crane which allows you to build things you could never build before? And these language models can operate at scale across a large corpus of the literature. And so I think there is an opportunity to think about checking for verification of papers by looking at scale on doing things like mining for claims, looking at the entire network of the citations that sit within those papers, and allow us to think about looking for verification checks in a different way to the way we may have done so before. And I'm beginning to see some tools emerging, but then we turn into questions like how well do those tools work within workflow? How affordable are they? What's the iteration cycle on them? Those are business problems, but we begin to open the door to address these problems in ways that we have not been able to think about before. And I would invite this audience and those of you who are experts to think about your workflows and ask yourselves, if you had a magic bullet that could allow you to work with the corpus in a different way, what would be the use cases that would drive the most value there for you, for the industry, for your journals? Because the cost of trying some of these ideas is going to come down somewhat. And so it may be that the way these things change our industry are in ways that we can't imagine yet. We're still really talking about how they apply to the workflows as we understand them today, or the tasks as we understand them today. Do these open up the opportunity to do things radically differently? I think that's the way we have an opportunity to think about over the next year, 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the detection of bad actors, Emily, I mean, is this something that you guys have had a good look at? Have you got any numbers that you can share in terms of you get a sense of, how much might be coming from AI-generated, paper mills or what have you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I don't have firm data, because I think it's very difficult to make a definitive judgment about whether something is just simply poor quality research or if it's something that's artificially generated. But I can say that we have seen a striking increase in the number of poor quality submissions that don't meet our publication criteria. And as a sound science journal, we do pride ourselves on considering and publishing research that contributes to academic knowledge. And we've seen over the past couple of months a really stark increase in submissions that just don't even meet that sound science bar that we have for ourselves. And I would also argue, one of the things that really blew me away when I came to PLOS One, knowing the reputation of the journal that it has in some communities, was the amount of human oversight over every single paper. We get a bonkers number of submissions every day, and a subject matter expert, reads every single one of those. So our editorial model is also very high touch, but it's not deterring the bad actors, because I think that they see a sound science journal like ours, and they think that perhaps this is an easy way to get to be published. And so I think that we as an industry need to come together to enforce our standards, to ensure that we're putting quality over profit, to make sure that we are really fulfilling our role as guardian of what it means to promote knowledge and to share information, and hope that by presenting a united front we can potentially deter some of this behavior. But it really is about quality over profit.
Yeah, I mean, the quality control thing is absolutely vital, and I guess one way that potentially AI tools could help is around peer review. In terms of perhaps helping with the statistical analysis, doing a first pass, helping peer reviewers. I mean, is that something that you think is a pipe dream, Ian? Is it something that's more likely to happen? I mean, as we were talking about over lunch, anything's possible in 20, 30, 40 years. But in the shorter term, do you think there will be tools that will help peer reviewers do a better job? And peer reviewers are it's the bottleneck for many of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a paper that came out towards the beginning of this year, maybe February, March, where some academics used these tools to peer review their own papers just to get a different view on it. And their reaction was that GPT 3.5 at the time gave them comments that they found were helpful. It gave them an editor who was constantly available and gave timely responses, and gave slightly different comments to the human comments that they were getting from the human peer reviewers. So first question is, could they be useful to the authors? There is a paper which suggests that yes, it can already in its current iteration. Second question is, could it replace what we're doing today? We have to be very careful with that, but I think it's worth exploring for sure. And I think it's worth exploring in terms of, can it possibly lift the burden around some of the editorial checks that we look for in a paper, like are there mentions of patients in the paper which shouldn't be there? Are ethical guidelines referenced? The stuff that is more procedural but looser in text, so harder to create rules-based algorithms around, should be able to help there. I think it's worth exploring what they can do on the qualitative side, caveat all of the concerns that we need to be aware of. And we're going to start a small pilot at BMJ with one of our editorial teams, trying to look at this over a corpus of about 400 manuscripts over the coming months. We'll see how that goes. Yeah. I didn't really answer your question there, I think, but...
I think none of us know the answer. I think that's part of the problem. But what we do know is one of the biggest problems we face as an industry is peer review.
Yeah.
And if there is a way of using AI to help that process, then I'm sure everyone would be very much looking for that. I mean, Jessamy, you wrote an opinion piece in The Lancet earlier this year, which was really nicely done. And it posed some questions that I hadn't properly thought through in the past. And one of them was about bias. We know that human beings have lots of inherent biases, and of course, large language models are learning from our biases, so therefore they themselves might be biased. How do we make sure that we don't build systems that are just learning from our bad behavior, our inherent biases? I mean, you wrote that piece, and presumably, or perhaps you've been, thinking about that in terms of what others are doing there. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I think it's extremely interesting and very relevant, particularly for the medical research field, where we see more and more evidence of bias in algorithms, bias in the way that medicine has been developed on a historically sort of racist, white supremacist and exclusionary basis. So I think there's the one line of thinking that would say kind of a quality machine type process, where actually it's easier to remove bias from an algorithm than it is from a human. There are lots of people that will say that. And there's a paper recently in Nature that probably many of you have read, which looks at covert and overt racism in large language models. And actually what it found was that it was very difficult to remove covert racism, things like how dialect is used. So that's a sort of argument to it's easier to remove bias from an algorithm than it is from a human. And then I think the other side is that we know we're building large language models. A very small group of people are doing that, who represent a very small group of the world in terms of their characteristics, and are not necessarily thinking about the data that is being used to build those models. And we must change that now, because otherwise it's going to be compounded and embedded as we move forward. So it's definitely something that we have to be thinking about. And I think for me, it's a major negative and a deterrent for why we should be using generative AI more in research or in medicine in particular, because of those biases and those algorithms that we haven't really got a handle on in terms of being able to remove.
Yeah, I mean, Ian, what's your thoughts in terms of removing the bias? How easy or likely is that?
It's really hard. So the first generation of language models that we're now kind of very familiar with, GPT and so forth, were trained on primarily a thing called the Common Crawl corpus, which is basically a snapshot of the internet. And I don't know if any of you checked recently, but the internet's a cesspit, and that language that is prevalent in the crawls that these systems have taken up is rife with the worst biases. And they went through a process to get to an interface that you could interact with, and it was a reinforcement learning from human step. But if you were to just interact with the raw model, it's like talking to a deluded ancient wizard with no real connection to human mores that just gabbles on and on and on and on. And so they create these processes of these reinforcement learning steps from humans which attempt to draw a better looking facade in front of the models. But the models themselves, behind all of that, still encode all of that issues that we have in human language and in the human corpus. And so I don't think you can ever remove the bias in the training step. You have to be very aware of the fine-tuning step that happened, and you have to be very aware of the systems that you're putting that processor model to play in and where biases may appear. I don't think we can remove the biases from the machine, but I think it can help us confront the underlying biases that emerged that are entrained in the machine that sometimes it might be harder for us to admit ourselves. And so you have to have accountability on the decision step, and you have to be looking at those decisions to see if there is a weighting that's happening that goes against the idea of ethical fairness or equitability that you have embedded in your editorial processes. And then you can say, yeah, there is bias, and that is easier to confront because you're confronting the fact that it's embedded in a system rather than maybe embedded in people who are making those decisions. But you cannot remove that bias so long as those models are trained on the corpus of human language, which is itself intrinsically biased. That's my current view.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the trends at the moment in publishing, and when I'm scanning the newswires, I keep seeing is around plain language summaries. Lots of people, particularly in the clinical space and pharmaceutical companies, are very interested in creating a plain language summary of a randomized controlled trial or an evidence base. And that's great, but the problem is potentially that you end up with a summary of all the stuff that's worked, and particularly for all the stuff that's worked that a pharmaceutical company has paid for, rather than something which is broader. I guess generative AI gives us the potential. Jesse, I'm interested in you from a patient perspective, from a clinical perspective. You know, we could create lots of lay language summaries of clinical content, even assuming that we can get the QC right. Is that something that we should be doing? Is that going to be something that's helpful, do you think, to the patient population or the clinician population?
Democratizing knowledge and making knowledge more accessible and available to people who have healthcare problems and who are trying to access different forms of healthcare is extraordinarily important in the sort of desire to increase health literacy, which has many, knock-on effects in terms of improving health at a population level. Again, it really depends on the implementation and how that's implemented. And I think when you look at other forms of technology within the healthcare system, what we often find is that if it's part of the main healthcare delivery system, then there's some benefit in that because it's across the board. But what we have trouble with is where there's a commercial interest or it's supplementary to the main form of healthcare delivery. And then you get the biases, then you get the focus on only positive results, then you get the focus on things that people want to sell. And that's the difficulty. And we as a healthcare community are not very good at regulating that, or indeed as a sort of political or governmental organisation.
So at the BMJ, Ian, is that something you've been talking about?
Yeah. We're very nervous about the idea of putting summaries at the moment on the articles because of the quite easy way of slightly misinterpreting the result at this point in time. So any place where there's a potential patient safety risk, that's an area that we take very seriously. But I think there are like just two other components to your question that I'd reflect on. One is these tools don't remove some of the fundamental challenges we have around things like bias in healthcare systems. So we can't say that a tool is going to come along and fix problems that need to be fixed in a different way. I think another issue that we need to address is many folks are going to look for their healthcare information in quite informal ways. And even though it's not recommended, I'm certain many people are just going to ChatGPT to ask them for medical advice. And there's a question around if the tool does slightly better than another really bad system, is that okay? I don't know the answer to that, you know.
Yeah.
But I know there's a lot of work happening at Google to look at creating medically specific LLMs. That's a big area of investment. I really worry about these things, but I don't have an answer. That's a really big area of uncertainty for me.
So, I mean, I guess in many ways it's clearer cut perhaps for clinical work, because obviously there's real patient safety concerns. But you could argue perhaps for biology or physics or chemistry, the risk is lower. So my understanding is on bioRxiv, there's a summary, right, that's generated. Is that right? I think I wrote about that once. What are you thinking about for PLOS? I mean, because you've got a huge body of information there. You could create lay language or plain language summaries at scale. You may not be able to QC them all given the amount of content.
Yeah.
How do you get the balance? Because the risk is lower, right, in terms of getting it wrong.
Well, I would say that our focus is always on reliable information, and that we wouldn't want to put out anything that hadn't been QC'd by a human, right? We really invest heavily in...
But it would be accessible.
But our content is, so I think our content is used to feed the LLMs that exist, right? And so, it's in there, it's in the mix already of some of these Gen AI tools. I think that if we were to put it on our publishing platform, we have a responsibility to our audience, to our readership, to make sure that we would stand behind it. And so I think we would be reluctant to add a lay summary that hadn't been vetted by an expert.
So a summary is one thing, right? And so like one of the risks of summary is just the space of the words is smaller. So if you make a mistake, you could infer the wrong inference or claim because you're throwing information away. It's like a map, but it's a low-resolution map. So this is part of the risk we have here. I'm going to create quite a low-resolution map at scale. And if I make mistakes, the person interacting with that is going to get the wrong idea. And as a publisher, I don't want that. And if my author finds out, it'll be a big brouhaha, and that's really bad for our reputation. But there are other things you can do. So you can pipe the full text of the paper to a language model, pipe it to a model that can create human voice, whisper, OpenAI, and then you can ask the prompt to say, create a podcast with two people with different perspectives talking about what happened in the paper, and give it as much time as you wish to discuss the paper. Now, I've seen someone do that with one line of code, and in minutes create a 40-minute podcast on one paper. So there are things. So we're not thinking in that way. And that gives you the space to allow for interaction with that content in a more accessible way, for example.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end of the session, and obviously we want to have some questions from you. But before we do that, I want to ask each of you a very quick question about, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic? So Jessamy, you wrote that you felt that it wasn't going to be okay. AI and scientific publishing is not going to be okay. Do you still feel that way? Is there anything we've said today that's making you feel more optimistic, or are you still feeling quite pessimistic about the future of AI and publishing?
I'm an optimistic person, and I do feel optimistic about the future. I mean, I wrote that piece slightly as a sort of, trying to just think through, as one does when we write things. We're trying to kind of think in ink. And these are some of the questions that I think, we all think about all the time. But I'm a fundamentally optimistic person, and I think that there's huge potential for artificial intelligence and generative AI to help the production of knowledge and the accessibility and the availability of knowledge. And, to Ian's point, we've got a huge mis and disinformation problem around health topics, which is there's a sort of strange Venn diagram going on with wellness, poor life expectancy and poorer health around the world, and people who are feeling disenfranchised, and then mis and disinformation around health. And actually, all the evidence and the literature base suggests that the more information you can have, the more access that people can have, then that is a deterrent to mis and disinformation. It's when there are information voids in particular topics that have been ignored by mainstream medicine or are outside of the sort of typical medical establishment,
that's when mis and disinformation really thrives. So I do feel optimistic on a number of different counts, but we need to be thinking about it all the time.
Okay, how about you, Emily?
I feel very optimistic.
Everyone's optimistic. We like this. This is great.
Yeah, well, about the potential for AI to support authors. I think we heard really eloquently yesterday that it shouldn't be used as, external human brain, but there are some tasks that it's really good at. So we mentioned earlier about all of the journal style guides, so formatting references and making sure that the manuscripts comply with style, or just getting away from style altogether. I think we see some real potential for tools in that. And then as an editor, I see great potential for AI to support the work that I do in terms of, things as simple as matching manuscripts to academic editors or manuscripts to peer reviewers, to looking for hallmarks of research integrity, the badging that we were talking about with Verichive earlier. I think there are a lot of really wonderful opportunities to improve the trust that the public has in published literature, to improve accessibility, as long as it's used responsibly.
Okay. And I'm guessing, Ian, technology is your thing. You're going to be optimistic, right?
Yeah, just after this conversation, though, I'm reminding myself of the things that I worry about when we talk about these things.
Yeah.
So I feel like we now have a technology which is like a calculator for text. It can manipulate text, almost interpret text in a way we've never had before. And every part of our value chain as publishers is text-based, from the search, the writing, the editing, the peer review, the dissemination. And so there's no part of our value chain where this technology may not have an impact. I think that's really exciting. I think as well, what we do is not that old. The scientific process may be 300 years old. Doing so in a digital context, 15, 20, 25 years old. We have hundreds of years ahead of us and tools of increasing capability to play with. It's massively exciting. I get nervous about it. I get excited by it. I think it's going to be a couple of really interesting years. I think for our industries, our business models, there's a lot of risk, but equally, people's attention span is quite narrow. And so I think we have a duty of care on a number of points here. We have a duty of care to the scholarly record, so we have a duty of care to share our experiences with each other and to be the good actors who are trying to make this technology work well for society, because there will be plenty of bad actors who are doing the opposite. We also sit on brands that carry reputation. So when we find the things that work, we have a duty of care to get behind those, because that can help amplify their positive impact in the world. And so I'm not only excited and nervous, I feel really strongly that as a community, we have an obligation to really lean into these tools and understand how to make the best use of them.
Brilliant. Jessamy, are you still there, or have we lost you? I'm not sure. While we see whether we're going to get Jessamy back, we'd like to move it over to questions. I can barely see out there, but if there is anyone, we've got a question out the front here, and Charles, I think, at the back, if I can see. Nope. Oh, there we go. Here we go. So if you could, we all know you, but if you could explain who you are, that would be great.
Hi, Heather Steens from Delta Think. Quite enjoyed the session today. I've got two boys, one is 21 and one is 23, and they had this now 1-2 punch of being thrown into online school for COVID, and now having ChatGPT, at their disposal. So, we're kind of, coming through this, like many of us came through the internet generation to now. And so I think we may never be able to have the exact perspective that they have, even if we try to understand it. But when you think about younger researchers that, may not have had the preparation in research integrity and writing and assessment, and the librarians are, desperately trying to compensate for some of these. But do you think that there might be, unique challenges as this generation that moves up, now they're in high school and they're in college and they didn't have a regular high school experience, and now that's going to be, younger researchers from that. It's a thought question more than anything else, but does that worry you at all?
Oh, I think it's an opportunity, right? I think it's an opportunity to learn from and understand the priorities of, people who are younger than I am and who have different desires when it comes to accessing scholarly information and want to use information in different ways. I think that, a lot of the things that we're talking about with research integrity have the undercurrent of fairness. And I think that fairness is such a deeply ingrained human trait that we're never going to get away from, what is fair, what is right. But I'm really excited about, these new ways of interacting with content. Some of what Ian was mentioning about, that potential for aggregation and not making discoveries, but linking together concepts in a new way. I think we have a lot to learn and a lot to be excited for. And I really want to step back from the idea that, this generation knows best and that we need to keep scholarly publishing working in the way that it has for the past 300 years, because it's clearly not going to.
I've got two young kids, a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old, and we're constantly keeping them away from screens and from social media. I think the media we create changes the patterns of our attention, and we don't really fully understand how that's playing out yet. So I think there's a huge opportunity for these tools to help us learn, but at the same time, I feel that there's a need for us to figure out how to learn without them in a little way beforehand, before applying them. But I could be wrong about that. I don't know. Another thing I think about them is they're kind of like magnifying glasses for our own behaviors. So do you remember email, right? Like when email came along, people was like, it's going to save us all this time. It's going to be great. We're going to we no longer have to go to the post office. We'll have all this extra time. What happened? Like, it swamped us, right? And so you hear people talking about Gen AI is going to come along. It's going to be your assistant and take away all this work. Well, if you're the kind of person who likes to load up work, you're going to be able to load up even more work. So they just become kind of magnifying glasses to ourselves. And so those younger generations of researchers, we have to embed good practices, good understanding of ethical practices, and then give them tools that will make them more powerful and more effective. But the core remains a human core, and those questions remain human questions, I think.
Okay, I think we're going to go to Bex, if we could, who I hope has got an online question. Can we have a microphone on Bex, please? Oh, there we go.
What are some of the... I've got two mics on and neither of them are working. What are some of the challenges for very small publishers in positive engagement with AI?
Oh, no, that's a good question, which I'm glad I don't have to answer.
Money.
Fundamentally.
Costs. Yeah, it costs. And if you don't have a huge tech team at your disposal.
I mean, we were talking about this a little bit over lunch again. We talked a lot over lunch. And you were talking about partnering, and I think that's a good point perhaps to pick up.
Yeah, so if we just go back to kind of the boring stuff like editorial workflows, research integrity issues, right? That vendors in our space are just all over themselves to create tooling here. And so don't build your own tooling, someone's going to do it for you, and just understand where you're creating value and negotiate hard. And if you're willing to sign up to being a use case, I'm sure you'll get very good rates at this moment in time. And so then the risk you have is opportunity cost because everyone is very busy. I think the second issue here is there is an ability to get really the best quality language models in the world at $15 a month per person who's using them. Don't be afraid to sign off on that credit card spend and get the people who need to experience a minimum of 10 hours to play with the tools to understand what they can do, and that will help you. But beyond that, the challenge for medium to small scale publishers is where are you creating unique value in the market, and does that require customization or custom development around workflow? And that's currently out of bounds of being able to be developed. There is an idea that the software cost will come down radically because these tools are phenomenal at developing software. For sure, go and play with Claude with its new tool called Artifacts, which is phenomenal. Get on that. So it's a mixed message here. I think the positives possibly outweigh the negatives, but capital constraints remain the single biggest challenge.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious that you probably all want to have a little bit of a break. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I'd like to thank the three panelists, Jessamy, Emily, and Ian, for your really kind thoughts, good thoughts and all of you for attending. So thank you very much. We will be around, so come and ask us questions if you'd like to.
Thank you, Jane.